They called it broken long before it ever met a human. The dragon lay chained in the farthest corner of the war outpost, its massive body curled inward as if trying to disappear into itself. Its scales, once said to shimmer like molten silver, were now dulled with ash, scars, and neglect. One wing dragged uselessly along the ground, torn at the edge as though something had ripped through it without mercy. Its eyes, when they opened, held no fire, no rage, no pride. Only a quiet emptiness that made even hardened soldiers uneasy. This was not how dragons were supposed to be. Dragons were storms, kings of flame and sky. This one was silence. "Why keep it?" a young recruit muttered one evening, glancing nervously at the creature as he passed by with a crate of supplies. "It doesn't fight, doesn't even react." "Because command thinks it might be useful," another soldier replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "Some kind of experiment. Or maybe they're just too stubborn to admit it's a lost cause." The dragon didn't move. It hadn't moved in days. Food was brought, left, sometimes eaten, sometimes untouched. No one got close enough to know which. No one wanted to. Something about the creature unsettled them, not because it was dangerous, but because it wasn't. Its stillness felt wrong, like a blade that refused to cut. Then came the day the warrior arrived. His name was Kale, though most simply called him the Iron Hound. Not because he was cruel, but because he endured. Battles, wounds, impossible missions. Kale survived them all with a quiet, stubborn resolve. He wasn't the strongest soldier in the ranks, nor the fastest, but he was the one commanders trusted when something needed to be handled. And now, apparently, that something was a broken dragon. Kale stood at the edge of the enclosure, arms crossed, studying the creature for a long moment before speaking. "That's it?" he asked, his voice flat. "That's it," the handler replied. "Doesn't fly, doesn't breathe fire properly, doesn't respond to commands. We tried conditioning, pressure, isolation, nothing works." He shrugged. "Command wants to assign it to you." Kale raised an eyebrow slightly. "Assign?" The handler gave a dry laugh. "If you can make it useful, it's yours. If not—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Kale stepped forward. The dragon did not react. Chains clinked softly as Kale approached closer, stopping just a few feet away. Up close, the damage was worse than he expected. Old wounds poorly healed. Fresh scars layered over older ones. This wasn't just neglect. It was repeated failure over and over again, until whatever spirit the creature had once possessed had been worn down to nothing. Kale crouched slightly, lowering himself, not in submission, but in quiet observation. Still no reaction. "Everyone tried to force you, didn't they?" Kale murmured, almost to himself. The dragon's eye flickered. Just once. Kale noticed. Interesting. He didn't reach out, didn't test his luck. Instead, he stood again and turned back toward the handler. "Remove the chains." The handler blinked. "That's not protocol." Kale didn't argue. He simply looked at him. After a moment, the handler sighed. "If it attacks, it won't." That confidence wasn't based on arrogance. It was something else, something quieter. Reluctantly, the handler signaled the others. One by one, the heavy chains were unlocked and pulled away, metal scraping loudly against the stone floor. The dragon remained still throughout, not even lifting its head as its restraints fell away. Freedom meant nothing to it. Kale watched carefully. Then, slowly, he stepped inside the enclosure. A few soldiers tensed nearby, hands instinctively drifting toward their weapons. But Kale raised a hand slightly, signaling them to hold. He walked closer, closer, until he stood within reach of claws that could have torn him apart in an instant, if the dragon had any will left to use them. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Kale did something no one expected. He sat down, right there on the cold ground, just a short distance from the dragon's head. No weapon drawn, no defensive stance, just sitting. "You're not broken," he said quietly. The dragon's eye shifted again. "You're just done." Silence stretched between them. Kale didn't fill it. He didn't push, didn't command, didn't demand. He simply stayed there, as if the absence of pressure was itself a kind of language. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, so slowly it almost seemed imagined, the dragon's head shifted. Not much. Just enough for its gaze to rest more fully on him. The soldiers watching from outside exchanged uneasy glances. "What is he doing?" one whispered. "No idea," another replied. Inside the enclosure, Kale exhaled quietly. "Yeah," he said under his breath. "I get it." He didn't try to touch the dragon. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small canteen. He took a sip, then placed it on the ground between them, not offering it directly, just leaving it there. An offering without expectation. The dragon's gaze lingered on the object. Then, after a long hesitation, its head moved slightly forward. The movement was weak, careful, as if even that small effort carried weight. Its nose nudged the canteen. Water spilled slightly onto the ground. The dragon paused, then lowered its head just enough to lap at it. The soldiers outside went completely still. It was the first voluntary movement anyone had seen in weeks. Kale allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "There you go," he murmured. "No commands, no force, just patience." The dragon drank slowly, then stopped, its head resting on the ground once more, but not quite as lifeless as before. Something had shifted, something small, but real. Kale stood up after a while, brushing dust from his hands. He didn't linger, didn't try to push further. As he stepped out of the enclosure, the handler looked at him with disbelief. "What did you do?" Kale shrugged lightly. "Nothing. That's not nothing." Kale glanced back once, watching the dragon for a brief moment. "It is," he said quietly. "That's the point." From that day on, things began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Kale returned regularly, never forcing interaction, never raising his voice. He would sit, sometimes speak, sometimes remain silent. He brought water, food, time, and little by little the dragon began to respond. Not with obedience, but with presence. It lifted its head more often. Its eyes followed movement. Once, it even shifted its body slightly to face him when he entered. The soldiers started to notice. Whispers spread. Maybe it's not useless after all. Or maybe it's just attached to him. Either way, it's changing. But not everyone was convinced. Because in a place built on control and power, patience looked a lot like weakness. And weakness was never tolerated for long. One evening, as Kale approached the enclosure once again, he noticed something different. The guards stationed nearby were tense. Too tense. "What happened?" he asked. One of them hesitated before answering. Command issued a new directive. Kale's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened slightly. "What directive?" The guard swallowed. "They're going to test it tomorrow." Kale turned his gaze toward the dragon. It was watching him, for the first time, fully aware. And for the first time, Kale realized something that made his chest tighten slightly. The dragon wasn't just recovering. It was starting to trust him. And whatever this test was, it was going to break that trust. The word test echoed in Kale's mind long after the guard had said it. Not because he didn't understand what it meant, but because he understood it too well. In places like this, tests were never about learning. They were about proving something, forcing a result, pushing until something either broke or submitted. And Kale had seen enough of both outcomes to know exactly how this would end if he did nothing. As he stepped into the enclosure that night, the dragon was already watching him. Its pale, dim eyes following his every movement with a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. That alone told him everything had changed. This wasn't the same hollow creature he had first met. This one was aware. This one was waiting. And worse, this one was beginning to hope. Kale crouched down in his usual spot, but there was no calm in him this time, no easy patience. "They're going to push you tomorrow," he said quietly. His voice lower than usual, roughened by something he rarely let surface. Loud, painful, confusing. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "Everything we didn't do." The dragon didn't move, but its gaze didn't leave him. Kale looked at it, really looked, and for the first time he saw not just damage but restraint. Not emptiness but control. This dragon hadn't lost its strength. It had buried it, locked it away where no one could reach it. They think you're broken, Kale continued. Tomorrow, they're going to try to prove it. Silence lingered between them, heavy but not empty. Then, slowly, the dragon shifted. It lifted its head higher than before. Not much, but enough to change its posture from defeated to present. Kale noticed immediately. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "Yeah," he murmured. "That's what I thought." For a long moment, neither of them spoke or moved further. But something passed between them then. Not words, not commands. Understanding. Kale reached into his pack, pulling out a strip of cloth. It wasn't anything special, just part of an old bandage, worn but clean. He hesitated for a brief second before placing it gently on the ground between them, just like he had done with the water before. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," he said quietly. "But if things go bad tomorrow, you don't have to let them break you again." The dragon's gaze dropped to the cloth, then back to him. For the first time, there was something faint in its eyes. Not fear, not pain. Something sharper. Something that had been missing since the beginning. Choice. Kale stood after a while, lingering just long enough to let the moment settle before turning to leave. He didn't look back this time. He didn't need to. Morning came too quickly. The outpost was louder than usual, filled with the clatter of preparation and the low murmur of anticipation. Soldiers gathered along the reinforced perimeter of the testing grounds, their expressions ranging from curiosity to cold indifference. To them, this was just another demonstration, another experiment. To Kale, it was a line. He stood near the edge, arms crossed, his posture still but his focus absolute. He had argued, of course. Not loudly, not recklessly, but firmly. It hadn't mattered. Command had already decided. "Let's see what your pet can do," one of the officers remarked as he stepped beside Kale, a faint smirk on his face. Kale didn't respond. The gates opened. Chains dragged briefly, not restraining, but guiding. As the dragon was brought into the center of the arena, it moved slowly, its damaged wing trailing slightly behind, its body still marked by every scar it had endured. But it was not the same as before. Its head was raised, not high but not lowered either. Its gaze moved across the space, taking everything in. Aware, watching, waiting. "Begin." The command was given. The first device activated immediately, a high-frequency emitter that sent a sharp, piercing sound across the arena. It wasn't loud to human ears, but to a dragon, it was disorienting, painful, designed to provoke. The dragon flinched, his body tensed. A low rumble built in its chest. Not a roar, not yet, but something close. Kale's hands clenched slightly at his sides. Hold, he thought, though he didn't dare signal it. Not here, not now. The second phase came without pause. A net launcher fired, crackling with energy designed to bind and restrict. The net struck across the dragon's side, electricity flaring as it tightened. The rumble in the dragon's chest deepened. Its body reacted, muscles tightening, wings shifting instinctively despite the damage. The soldiers leaned forward slightly, watching, waiting. "Now," the officer muttered. A third trigger. Pain. A concentrated pulse, directed straight into the dragon's nervous system. Not enough to kill, but enough to overwhelm. That's when it happened. The dragon roared. Not weak, not broken. Raw. The sound tore through the arena, echoing off stone and steel, shaking the air itself. Fire burst from its jaws, but unlike before, it didn't scatter wildly. It surged outward in a controlled stream, striking the ground just ahead of it, forcing the nearest soldiers to step back. The net snapped under the strain. The energy dissipated, and for a single moment everything froze. The dragon stood there, breathing hard, its body trembling. Not from fear, but from restraint. From holding something back that was more than instinct. Its gaze moved, past the soldiers, past the officers, until it found Kale. Time seemed to slow. Kale didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes locked onto the dragon's, steady and unyielding. Your choice. The dragon held that gaze. The arena waited. Another command was about to be given, another escalation, another push toward breaking point, but it never came, because the dragon made its decision first. The fire faded. Not extinguished, but controlled. The stance shifted not into attack, but into something else. Something deliberate. It lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in refusal. A clear, unmistakable message. No. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Confusion. Disbelief. That's not possible, one officer muttered. It should be reacting. It is reacting, Kale said quietly, cutting him off for the first time. All eyes turned to him. He didn't look away from the dragon. It's choosing. The silence that followed was heavier than any roar. The dragon stood its ground. Not attacking, not fleeing, not breaking. Just standing. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in the arena, but in every person watching. Because for the first time, they weren't looking at a broken creature. They were looking at something far more dangerous. Something with strength and control. Something that could not be forced. And something that, despite everything done to it, had decided not to become what they tried to make it. Silence didn't last long in a place like the outpost, but what followed the dragon's refusal was something far heavier than noise. It spread slowly at first, like a crack beneath stone, subtle but undeniable. Soldiers whispered. Officers argued in low, tense voices. No one quite knew what to call what they had just witnessed. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't defiance in the way they understood it either. It was something far more unsettling. A creature that had been pushed to the edge, given every reason to lash out or collapse, and instead had simply chosen not to. Kale remained where he stood even as the arena cleared, his gaze fixed on the dragon as handlers cautiously approached, unsure whether they were dealing with a weapon or something far less predictable. The dragon didn't resist as they guided it back toward the enclosure, but it didn't submit either. It walked under its own will, each step measured, each movement controlled. Not the staggering weakness they had grown used to, but something steadier, something aware. And when it passed Kale, just for a brief second, its head turned slightly toward him. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to confirm what neither of them needed to say out loud. That night, the outpost felt different. Kale didn't go to the enclosure immediately. For once, he waited. Not out of hesitation, but because he knew the dragon needed time. What had happened in the arena wasn't just survival. It was a boundary drawn, and boundaries, real ones, came with consequences. Command would not ignore this. They couldn't. A creature that could choose not to obey was not just useless to them. It was dangerous in a way brute force could never control. And sure enough, the summons came. Kale stood inside the command chamber, arms behind his back, as the senior officers debated openly, their patience thinner than usual. It demonstrated controlled aggression, one argued. That alone makes it valuable. Controlled? Another snapped. It ignored direct stimulus, refused escalation. That's not control, that's unpredictability. It didn't attack, the first countered. It could have. That's the problem. Kale remained silent until one of them turned sharply toward him. You've been working with it, the officer said. Explain. Kale met his gaze without hesitation. It's not broken. A scoff. We've established that much. No, Kale replied evenly. You haven't. The room stilled slightly. It's not broken, he repeated. And it's not a weapon you can force into shape. Everything you've tried before failed because you treated it like something to control. It doesn't respond to pressure. It shuts down or pushes back. He paused briefly. What you saw today wasn't failure. It was restraint. Restraint implies loyalty, another officer said coldly. And it has none. Kale shook his head slightly. It has choice. That's worse. There it was. The truth none of them wanted to say plainly. A weapon that chooses can also choose not to serve. Then we remove the choice, one officer stated flatly. Kale's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression didn't change. You already tried that. And we can try again with better methods. Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't uncertain. It was decided. Kale understood then. They weren't going to see reason. Not here. Not like this. Permission to continue my approach, he said. His voice steady but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. Give it time. You'll get better results than anything force can produce. And if we don't? Kale held the officer's gaze. Then you lose nothing you haven't already lost. The room remained still for a long moment. Then, reluctantly, the commanding officer exhaled. You have 1 week. Not long, but enough. Kale nodded once. Understood. When he returned to the enclosure later that night, the air felt quieter than usual. Not empty, but settled. The guards posted outside watched him with a different kind of attention now. Not suspicion, not dismissal. Something closer to curiosity. Maybe even respect, though none of them would say it. Inside, the dragon was awake. Not just watching, but waiting. Kale stepped in slowly, closing the distance without rushing. His movements as measured as the creature's had been earlier that day. He didn't speak immediately, didn't break the quiet. For a while he simply stood there. Then finally he sat. Same place as always. Same distance. The dragon's head lowered slightly. Not as low as before, but enough to close the space between them in its own way. They're afraid of you now, Kale said quietly. The dragon's eye shifted, studying him. Not because you're strong, he continued. They already knew that. Faint pause. Because you didn't use it. Silence lingered again. Kale reached into his pack, pulling out the strip of cloth he had left the night before. It was no longer where he had placed it. It now rested closer to the dragon's side, slightly crumpled but intact. He picked it up slowly. Figured you'd move it, he murmured. The dragon didn't react outwardly, but its gaze remained fixed on the cloth. Kale turned it over in his hands for a moment before speaking again. Where I come from, he said, his tone quieter now, almost distant. We used to tie these on things we didn't want to lose. The dragon blinked once. Not to hold them, Kale added. Just to remember. Carefully, deliberately, he stepped closer. Closer than he had ever been before. The air shifted slightly, tension threading through it. Not sharp, not hostile, but present. This was a line. One that couldn't be crossed without consequence. Kale didn't rush. He extended his hand slowly, the strip of cloth visible, his movements clear, predictable. No tricks, no force. If you don't want this, he said quietly, I won't push it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the dragon moved. Its head lowered further, not in submission but in allowance. Kale stepped into reach. Carefully, so carefully it almost felt unreal. He tied the cloth loosely around one of the dragon's forward horns. Not tight, not binding, just there, a ribbon. The dragon didn't pull away, didn't react at all, at least not outwardly. But something in the air changed, something subtle, something that didn't need to be seen to be understood. Kale stepped back after a moment, giving space again, his movements just as slow as before. He didn't reach out again, didn't test the boundary further. Doesn't mean anything, he said lightly. Not to them. His gaze met the dragon's. But it might to you. The dragon remained still, but its posture had shifted again, just slightly. Not weaker, not stronger, just different, present, aware, connected. Outside, one of the guards shifted uneasily. What did he just do? He muttered under his breath. Another shook his head slightly. I don't think that's the question anymore. Inside the enclosure, Kale sat back down once more, as if nothing significant had happened. But even he knew that wasn't true. Because this time, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was understood. And somewhere deep beneath the scars, the pain, and the long, heavy weight of everything the dragon had endured, something fragile had taken root. Not obedience, not control, but trust. And unlike everything else they had tried to build before, this was something that could not be forced, only chosen. By the 4th day, The outpost no longer felt like a place in control of its own creation. It felt like a place waiting for something it didn't understand. Word had spread beyond the inner command circles, carried in quiet murmurs and half-believed retellings. The broken dragon that refused to break, the creature that endured every test and chose not to destroy, the silent exchanges between it and a human mechanic who never raised his voice. Some called it luck. Others called it a flaw in the conditioning process. But a few, those who had seen the arena that day with their own eyes, had started calling it something else entirely. Choice. And that word, more than anything, made the officers uneasy. Kale could feel it in the way guards no longer stood too close to the enclosure, in the way commands were given with a fraction more hesitation, as if the illusion of control had already begun to crack. But unease alone wasn't enough to stop what was coming. It never was. On the 7th day, Kale was summoned again. This time, there was no debate waiting for him, only a decision already made. "We've observed long enough," the commanding officer said, his tone flat, final. "Your method has produced stability. But stability is not usefulness." Kale didn't react outwardly, though the words landed exactly as he expected. "We're initiating final evaluation," the officer continued. "Live scenario. Real variables. If the creature performs, we proceed with integration. If it doesn't, a slight pause. We terminate." There it was. Simple. Clean. Absolute. Kale held the officer's gaze. "And if it chooses not to participate?" A faint, humorless smile touched the man's lips. "Then it proves our point." Kale didn't argue this time. There was no point, because this was never about proving the dragon's capabilities. It was about forcing a decision. When Kale entered the enclosure that night, the dragon was already standing. Not resting, not watching from a distance. Standing. Waiting. The faint strip of cloth still rested where he had tied it, shifting slightly with each slow movement of the creature's head. It hadn't removed it, hadn't rejected it. That alone said enough. Kale stopped a few steps away, his posture steady, his expression quieter than usual. "Tomorrow," he said simply. The dragon's gaze didn't waver. "They're not testing your strength," Kale continued. "Not really. They're testing whether they can use you." A pause. "And if they can't." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The dragon understood endings. Silence stretched between them, heavier than it had ever been before, but not uncertain. Not confused. Clear. Kale exhaled slowly. "I can't tell you what to do," he said. "And I won't." He stepped closer, not as carefully as before, not hesitating at the boundary that had once been there, because it wasn't the same boundary anymore. "But whatever you choose," he added quietly, "make sure it's yours." The dragon lowered its head slightly, not in submission, not even in acceptance. Just enough to meet him closer. Acknowledgement. The next morning, the arena was different. Larger. Reinforced. Open to the sky instead of enclosed by stone. This wasn't a controlled test environment, it was a battlefield simulation. And unlike the previous trial, there was no audience pressed close to the edges. This time, they watched from a distance. Safer. More cautious. Kale stood alone near the far perimeter, separated from the command officers. Not by order, but by choice. The gates opened. The dragon stepped through. No chains this time. No restraints. Just open space. And waiting on the opposite side, 3 mechanized constructs, built to mimic large predators. Fast. Aggressive. Unrelenting. Not alive, but dangerous enough to force a response. "Begin," the command echoed. The constructs activated instantly, their movements sharp and precise as they spread out, circling, testing angles. One lunged first, fast, direct, aiming for the injured wing. The dragon moved, not with panic, with precision. It sidestepped, not fully avoiding the strike, but redirecting it. The construct's momentum carried it forward as the dragon turned, its tail striking out in a controlled arc, knocking the machine off balance without shattering it. The second attacked from the side. The dragon reacted faster this time, wings flaring slightly despite the damage, body shifting as fire burst forward. Not wild, not consuming, but focused. The flame struck just ahead of the construct, forcing it to halt rather than be destroyed. The third paused, adjusting, learning, just like the dragon was. From the command platform, voices rose in sharp confusion. Why isn't it finishing them? It has clear advantage. Why hold back? Kale didn't look at them, because he already knew the answer. The constructs attacked again, faster now, coordinated. And this time, the dragon didn't just react. It moved forward, not retreating, not avoiding, engaging, but not the way they expected. It struck not to destroy, but to disable. Precise blows, controlled fire. Each movement calculated, each action deliberate. One construct fell, systems failing but intact. Another was pinned, unable to move but not crushed. The third circled again, hesitating now, not because of damage, but because it couldn't predict the pattern. The dragon wasn't fighting like a weapon. It was fighting like something that understood restraint. Something that chose its limits. The final construct lunged, desperate, aggressive, all in. The dragon could have ended it in that moment. Everyone watching knew it. Instead, it stopped. Not fully, not completely still, but enough. Enough to let the construct halt just short of impact, its systems recalibrating in confusion. And then the dragon stepped back. Not retreating, disengaging. The arena fell silent. "No," one officer muttered. "That's not." "It's over," Kale said quietly. The commanding officer turned sharply. "It hasn't completed the objective." Kale finally looked at him. "It chose not to. That's failure." Kale shook his head once. "No," he said. "That's control." Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. Because deep down they all understood the truth. A creature that could destroy everything in front of it, and chose not to, was not a failed weapon. It was something far more powerful. The dragon turned then, not toward the constructs, not toward the officers, but toward Kale. And slowly, it walked to him. No command given. No signal followed. Just choice. It stopped a few feet away, lowering its head slightly, not in submission, not in obedience, but in recognition. The strip of cloth shifted gently against its horn in the wind. Kale stepped forward without hesitation, closing the distance the rest of the world still feared to cross. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Kale reached out, resting his hand lightly against the dragon's scales. No fear, no force, just contact. Around them, the outposts stood in silence, watching something they could not command, could not replicate, and could not fully understand. Because in the end, the dragon had not been fixed. It had not been tamed. It had not been broken into something useful. It had simply been given something no system, no test, no command could ever force into existence. A reason to choose differently. And that changed everything.